Hello, everybody. I will try to keep this brief because we've replaced the pick-me-up of coffee with the boring subject of due diligence. There we go, that's a nice picture for me. You've already got that. There we go. So, the first question is why be interested about due diligence? Why invest in due diligence? Why not just, if you're a mobile network, an aggregator, an intermediary, why not just connect anyone and make the money quickly? And that's certainly what we see in some of the developing markets. And that's what we saw originally in the UK itself. And the result was that in the UK we had a gold rush. There was a lot of money made. The regulator stepped in. The fines started. And due diligence has now become one of the big focal points with big risks attached. And those big risks are then scaring off people from entering the market, good players as well as the bad. So we saw last year a £330,000 fine for BT Agile Media because they had documentation but they weren't following it. We've seen, again, recently, after the new code has come into play in the UK via PhonePay Plus, another big fine handed out to one of the intermediaries for another £250,000. Again, because they saw the issues being with the lower levels of the value chain, and if something went wrong, it would be them that got the fine. So we can turn a blind eye, and that's clearly now no longer the case. And even outside of PhonePay Plus, we have, on top of that code, anti-money laundering regulations as well, which would equally come into play for anyone that is handling a value chain of cash. And simply not asking the questions has been shown to not be an adequate defense. You have to dig, and if you don't dig, you're at risk. So just last month, we saw Deutsche Bank with a huge, I think it was £183 million fine, following up from 2015 and 2017, again, for poor controls. So it is important to invest the money now to get things right, to avoid the big fines and the big issues later on. And of course, we probably want to do that anyway, because we're good guys, right? So, what does good due diligence look like? Now, I'm going to focus here particularly on what PhonePay Plus in the UK say has to be done. But, as I say, in the developing economies, as mobile networks are switching on billing around the world, to avoid that boom and bust, this is a good thing to copy now. Let's make it self-regulation rather than oppressive government-led or regulator-led sanctioned-based controls. So documenting processes is the first thing. So it's not just about doing the right thing, it's about making sure that what you're doing is recorded. And as we saw with BT Agile Media, what you've got recorded, make sure you're doing that. Then we come on to the collection of the specific information. So in the UK, there's actually a code annex that goes through a number of required pieces of information that would need to be collected. A number of those are fairly obvious. Director names, director addresses. Then you get into breach histories and checks and checks of company's house, checks to make sure they're registered with the regulator, as well as information about who there is in the company and what their roles are, so organisation charts. But that list isn't exhaustive. If during your due diligence processes you find something that looks suspicious, then you need to dig further. And all that information then needs to be verified as well. So what we've come across is questions of, well, is there a tick box approach? Can I just collect this information? Is everything going to be fine? And I can park that in the filing cabinet and wonderful, done. Well, no, I'm sorry to say there isn't a tick box approach. It has to be situational led. So That means if you go to company's house and you look up an individual and you see they're related to another company that might have a breach history, then you need to do another line of inquiry down there, and that might lead to another rabbit hole, and this might take a good few hours, but it's better to get that right now than have the problems later on. And then once you've done all this work to get your client onboarded, you've connected them up, you've given them billing opportunities into the mobile network, then it moves on to spot checks, and as that relationship develops, to make sure that you're looking at how they're advertising, what they're doing, to make sure that if they're using PIN verification, to do some auditing on that PIN verification checks to make sure that all of those transactions have got a valid two-factor authentication or PIN loop in place. And also to make sure that if you're dealing with multiple layers of a value chain, where there's more than one intermediary, to make sure that the intermediary below you has done the right checks on their partners. And it's all the same questions. So the mobile networks in the UK have agreed upon a standard set of questions which goes to all of the intermediaries, and that doesn't matter whether you're responding to Vodafone, O2, EE or 3, you're going to be responding to the same set of questions. So they've made it as easy as possible. And those same set of questions is a fantastic template to use on your downstream partners as well. So ongoing risk check assessments is really then a sort of culture of how you then take it to the sort of evolving level. So you might have assessed that a client is low risk or high risk when you signed them up, but that may change over time. And that's one of the big changes of what we saw in the PhonePay Plus Code of Conduct in April last year, is that this is not a one-off process. As I say, it's not parking it in the filing cabinet and forget about it. It's keep going back, seeing what the evidence is. So for mobile networks, they will be looking at complaint data coming into the call center and using that to steer their investigation. It will be looking at some of the higher risk clients and what advertising is going on, what traffic is coming on, whether you're seeing peaks or troughs which seem unnatural. And all these things are part of a risk assessment which may drive further investigation, and the outcome of that may well push the risk level up, or over a period of time you may even see a high risk client graduating down to low risk. And all of this needs to be contained in a tamper-proof form. So ideally using a third party to be able to audit and verify that the information that you're collecting is not been tampered with, that you haven't had issues that you've brushed under the carpet, and that you haven't changed your policies at the last minute just because the regulator knocked on the door and you realised that you didn't have something in place that you always should have. So I talked about the risk-based approach. So essentially, you're starting over here, which is your very low-risk services of things like charities or something where you wouldn't expect there to be a natural problem. So you're not going to need to check and review those as regularly, nor dig as deep. So high-risk services by nature may be about their pricing. It may be about adjudication histories that you found during the due diligence process, or it may be about the genre itself. Or indeed, one of the big issues that we've seen when we've been looking around, we'd already do the due diligence on behalf of 3 of the mobile networks in the UK, is geographic. So we saw a lot of past issues coming from Cyprus. So now when we see providers coming in, launching new services with a Cyprus address, that is normally a good reason to dig a bit deeper. And by doing that, we've been able to actually go down the rabbit hole and find that there were problems which weren't already flagged up by the aggregators in their own due diligence, because they'd only looked at a UK level. Then we can take this risk proportionate approach, and I will go into a bit more detail about what that might look like in a later slide. So a DDRAC is an opportunity really to be able to show that you've lowered the risk. Then we can't always prevent an issue, but what we can do is demonstrate that we did as much as we possibly can. So that's why we've always advised anyone we're working with, whether that's in the UK or globally, to document as much as possible the good things they are doing. Use this as an opportunity of a shield that if things come up, you can show what you did and why that was a reasonable approach. So each client's risk plan should focus on particular risk drivers for that client. So at a low-risk area, you may do low-frequency checks. You may want to grant permissions and controls around hosting pages that you might not grant if there were past issues. At the medium level, you're then going to start looking more at monthly trends and digging a bit deeper. And you will probably want to be doing around a 50% check, spot check of the services that are running and the other problems that are being seen, then responded to. And you may be wanting to request those PIN logs and make sure you're doing a regular audit to check that, as I say, all of the transactions have a valid consumer verification attached to it. And then you start getting to the high-risk services where you're really going to be wanting to check everything and be doing that regularly. You've been wanting to look at the payment page, making sure that what the consumer is being promised is right. You're going to be wanting to make sure those providers have got fraud blocking mitigations in place, PIN loops in place. And then at a very high-risk level, you may well start to then bring into play KPI audits, or even request, as we've been requested by one of the mobile networks in the UK, to actually go in and physically audit the processes of some of the connected parties to make sure that they've got all of the right paperwork in place, what they're doing in terms of risk control is adequate, and that the information that they have is not being messed with or tampered with. So very last slide, because I can see that's flashing. What does the future look like? So in the UK, actually, I've told you, we've gone from a Wild West. We've been through an evolution of problems. We've seen the regulator come in. We've seen complaints spike. And we've now seen complaints really level off to a point that Ofcom, who's the ultimate regulator, who had a regulatory agency, PhonePay Plus, in place, has now made a decision to bring it back in-house because there's just not enough work to justify the regulator having that agency anymore. And that is down to the strong work for mobile networks to regulate themselves, to do good due diligence, to do good checks. And if we can do this effectively in other countries, then we can make sure we can protect the longevity of the industry and make sure we don't see what we saw in Canada, which was going to be a great market, but was quickly switched off when the bad actors entered and spikes in complaints put off the mobile networks from wanting to enter the space. So thanks so much, Tim.